You're now tuned in to the Better Brain Podcast with your hosts, Miles Suril and Dr. Michael Lewis. Dive deep into the world of brain health, the latest in neurobiology, natural health, and nutrition. Stay up to date with groundbreaking research and discover the power of natural products and lifestyle choices. Stay curious and stay informed, because when it comes to your brain, knowledge is power.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Better Brain Podcast. This is episode 2. My name is Miles Suril. I am pursuing a PhD in pharmacology at the University of Padova, and joined with me is my co-host, Dr. Mike Lewis.
Hey, Miles, great to be with you again.
Thanks so much for joining.
This one off. The last one was fun. This one I think is going to be even more interesting and exciting.
Well, you know, with the Better Brain Podcast, we like to kick things off by discussing breaking news. And just last week, you sent me an article that is really relevant to what we were thinking of talking about today anyway. Today is the serotonin episode. We want to talk about everything serotonin. And Mike, can you tell me a little bit about the article that you forwarded to me?
Well, I thought it was kind of interesting as I kind of look up here to the Journal of Cell, and the title of it, let me get back up to the top, Serotonin Reduction in Post-Acute Sequelae of Viral Infection. So basically what it's talking about is COVID-19 and how COVID-19 is, and particularly long COVID, has been now associated with low serotonin levels. So they set out to try to explore why that is and what might be the mechanisms. But I think, to me, one of the most exciting things is way buried down in the discussion, and is so what do you do about it? And I think that's where our conversation will go.
Really cool. I mean, reading through the paper, first off, it's a Cell paper, so you know it's going to be good. It's one of the most prestigious journals in biomedicine, I would argue. And it also really addresses a critical need here that we're now in the end of 2023, and we have a number of medical solutions to deal with acute COVID, but this idea of long COVID is still a mystery to many physicians. Those in the naturopathic and perhaps alternative world have been using some nutraceuticals with some limited success. But I think that there's a real unmet need here. So this article that you forwarded, I think the scientists do a really elegant job of describing this new mechanism of action, this new relevant way in which we can manage long COVID. And I think the other exciting thing is the solutions for it are pretty simple, and a lot of mainstream media picked it up, right? This article was, discussed about in NPR, New York Times, et cetera, many radio stations. So I think that in and of itself is pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, sometimes the headlines grab attention for all the wrong reasons, but this one I think was one of the better examples for the right reasons. We can certainly, I'm not a copywriter and not a newspaper man or anything like that, but you always want to grab attention with your titles of an article. But again, this, a lot of times it goes in the wrong direction, I think, and we've certainly seen that, especially in nutritional science, where studies are flat out called negative and, harmful and whatever, and there's no such thing, particularly in a nutritional study. So to see more of a positive spin on this one, I think is good and refreshing.
Absolutely. I agree with you there. So this addresses long COVID in particular. Now, as a physician with infectious disease, I guess not specialty, but some expertise, more understanding than I, background, yes. Can you please highlight some of the key features of long COVID?
Well, some of the issues are really one of the biggest ones, and this paper addresses it pretty pointedly, is that it's a lot like concussions in a way, where you have the brain fog, you're fatigued, you're not thinking clearly. Basically, it's a decrement against your brain health. And so that's a big issue, not even getting into the blood clotting issues and other potential issues that can, be devastating, literally, or causing problems, maybe some of the brain health problems. If you've got, some blood clots going to the brain, that's what we call stroke. So it may be mini strokes, it could be, as opposed to a full-blown stroke. But certainly one of the concerns is things like cardiac, the damage that COVID can do to the cardiac system, to the heart and so on. But not just the heart, it's your blood vessels and things like that. So it's one of the reasons why I've always advocated since the beginning of COVID is make sure you take your fish oil.
Yeah.
Because omega-3s will help keep your blood from clotting too easily. And that's important, especially in COVID.
Yeah. Well, as we'll soon learn, there may be some other key nutrients that can help us manage some of the post-COVID symptoms or the long COVID symptoms. Because in this study, the scientists at Penn had specifically linked long COVID to reduced circulating serotonin levels. And what I want to highlight here is that serotonin, of course, is not just about the brain. I mean, it gets most of its pizzazz as the mood hormone, your happy hormone, if you will. But
somebody once, a mentor of mine once said that all targets, the targets of all hormones are the brain.
Yeah.
Now, it does other things, obviously. It depends on whether you're talking about whether testosterone or growth hormone or thyroid or serotonin or dopamine, the neurotransmitters, but ultimately all hormones have a target in the brain.
Yeah. I mean, serotonin is incredibly fascinating because among its many activities, it serves activities as a hormone and as a neurotransmitter. It has paracrine and autocrine functions. But, it gets most of its attention, especially in relationship to mood and depression. But 80 to 90% of the body's serotonin is produced within the gut, where it serves as a hormone and a neurotransmitter in the gut. I mean, you mentioned the platelets as well, the hypercoagulability in the blood and some of the issues that people are having with blood flow and post-COVID. Serotonin is stored within platelets. So, we're hitting on a couple of key unifying features here. I mean, one of my favorite factoids about serotonin is that when they were first researching the compound in the 30s and 40s, they found this molecule in an extract of enterochromaffin cells, and they called it enteramine. And then almost, 10 years later, they realized, oh, wait, that's serotonin. And where does the name serotonin come from? It comes from serum tonifier, serum vasoconstrictor. So in the early part of the 1900s, they weren't even thinking about its neurochemical activity. A lot of its focus was on what it's doing peripherally. So that's the introduction that I wanted to give for kind of the important role that serotonin may have in long COVID, because the mechanism that the scientists uncover in this paper really starts in the gut, even though they're talking about brain fog. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, absolutely. I mean, so they make a wonderful, coherent argument that it all starts with tryptophan. So serotonin ultimately is derived from tryptophan. Sort of, we always think of tryptophan as the post-Thanksgiving turkey, sleepiness and so on. And yes, that is true. That is tryptophan. But tryptophan, gets made into a couple of different things, serotonin being one of them, but, oh my goodness, I just blanked on it. Melatonin. There we go. But melatonin, of course, melatonin we associate with sleep. So, that's where that sleepiness comes from. So it's, so one of the arguments it's not really an argument. One of the ways they lay it out is that in long COVID, we have a decreased uptake by our cells, our enterocytes in the gut of tryptophan.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have the natural building block for serotonin getting absorbed in the gut, then you're obviously you're running short on the supply, and you're gonna run short on the serotonin. And
Right,
so
right.
that's kind of how they start off talking about it.
And as a scientist myself, I'm always fascinated by the narrative that the authors of the article describe their paper. Because, for people that might not have ever published a scientific paper before, I like to think of these things as narratives. People seek out to answer a question in science through a number of different steps. And one of the reasons why this paper was published in such a good journal is because the scientists did a really excellent job of doing experiments for each one of these steps to really answer the question backward and forward. So I just really wanted to discuss how the scientists started with even figuring out that serotonin might be involved. I mean, what they did is a metabolomic screen of 1,540 different individuals with long COVID. So specifically, they took the plasma of the patients and just screened for what's going on in their blood. What different molecules are present in those individuals that have long COVID, those that are people that had COVID and then recovered, and those with acute COVID. And they found that among all of the hundreds of thousands of different molecules that could be present in the human body, that serotonin was the most significantly downregulated in long COVID. Also in acute COVID, right? So this is a feature of infection in general. In fact, the scientists then went on in mice to show that any type of viral infection can deplete serotonin. So it's not necessarily about COVID itself. It's rather that this immune response to viruses is what depletes the serotonin. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think that this sounds like a conserved evolutionary mechanism that humans evolved, that when they're sick, to feel cruddy and have fatigue so that you stay in bed and that you don't infect your tribe, right? You don't infect the other cavemen and women, right?
Good way to look at it.
So, but then the problem, of course, is if your body cannot resolve that long-term inflammation that's caused by this unresolved viral reservoir, in this case COVID, then that's going to result in this persistent sickness response that these scientists demonstrated is caused by low serotonin.
Well, and if you want to look at it from that perspective as well, is so what happens when your gut is infected and not working properly is you don't feel like eating. And we know that fasting can be a very powerful, I'll call it a medicine, if you will, but fasting can be very powerful in helping our bodies heal. And so, it kind of all fits together that a lot of these viruses have such a profound effect on the gut itself. And then, of course, where we're all leading, you and I are leading to with this is, of course, the gut-brain connection.
Right.
And you certainly can't discuss that without talking about the vagus nerve as well. So
yeah. So if you want to lead us into that, because real briefly, what the scientists ultimately found is that so what are these type 1 interferons that are part of the classic antiviral response in our immune system downregulates the expression of the transporters for tryptophan, and then the cells take up the tryptophan, they convert it to serotonin, and then they found that having healthy levels of serotonin ensures that the vagus nerve is working properly, and that in the presence of this immune antiviral inflammatory response, there's not enough serotonin, the vagus nerve is not working properly. So why is that important?
Well, the vagus nerve is one of our 12 cranial nerves. Comes off the cranial nerves come off the base of the brain, basically, and each of them has very specific functions. But the vagus, though they're all unique, but the vagus nerve is, you could argue, maybe the most unique. It's got both efferent and afferent pathways, so it's a 4-lane highway in both directions. Providing information and also allowing for, say, peripheral stimulation. So it's a two-way highway, between the gut and the brain. But the vagus nerve, it said that vagus comes from the Latin meaning the wanderer. And the vagus nerve, when you have your cranial nerves, you've got two sets. You've got a set on your left and a set on your right. And so you've got two vagus nerves, really. We always just call it the vagus nerve, but it's really two. And it touches everything from, goes down through your neck, touches the baroreceptors and your carotid arteries, and help, measuring and affecting in both directions, right? Listening to and affecting your blood pressure. And then it continues on down and it touches your lungs and it touches your heart. And so and again, in both directions, feedback as well as stimulating, if you will. And then ultimately it spreads throughout the gut. And so it's really is that 4 or 6 lane divided highway between the gut and the brain. And one of the things I think is fascinating about the vagus nerve, in my opinion, from a clinical standpoint, is can we stimulate the vagus nerve? And there's implantable, literally surgically implantable vagus nerve stimulators, which I'm not a particularly big fan of. Not that I've ever seen one or had any experience with them, but it just seems a little invasive to me. But the external stimulators that you could literally put on your neck, right alongside your carotid artery, and you can electrically stimulate the vagus nerve. But you know what the best way is to stimulate your vagus nerve? The easiest one everybody can do? Miles?
If I were to take a guess, it's some deep breathing exercises.
Absolutely, right? Affects your lungs, but, doing good, deep, meditative type of breathing can absolutely have a major effect on your vagus nerve tone, and that's going to affect both sides of the highway.
So I love the idea that since the scientists had shown that restoring serotonin levels could positively impact the vagus nerve, which then positively erases a lot of the detriments of the cognitive deficits in long COVID, then the question becomes, do we even need any, fancy medications? Is it possible to do deep breathing or other, some of these other vagus nerve tonifying techniques to improve the symptomatology of long COVID? I guess this is to be answered, right? We don't know yet.
Yeah, it's there. The short answer would be yes, I believe that's possible in theory. In practice, it's much, much more difficult because how long are you doing deep breathing? How much are you doing? I mean, I can tell you, numerous cases, for example, if you're getting a dental procedure, for example, that's really uncomfortable, the best thing you can do is focus on your breathing. And when you focus on your breathing, it decreases your pain. Or increase your pain tolerance, if you will. But you can certainly decrease your pain. I've spent enough time on the sidelines of different sports, and, a kid gets hurt on the football field and you go out there, and I don't care whether his knees bent over backwards or broken leg or whatever. The first thing I always did was grab his face mask, stare at him nose to nose, and say, you need to breathe. And take some deep breaths, 3 deep breaths with me. And just the amount of just 3 good deep breaths doing it with somebody calms that whole overdrive of the nervous system, that I've been injured and, you lose your breath. And so it can have a profound effect. And I'll just finish up. That's like one huge one. But, how you can help control pain and ultimately really focus. But one of the more interesting things I've done in the last couple of years was, I won't go into the details, but I was somewhere in Europe, and a good friend of a cousin of mine is a breathing expert. She's got a PhD in neuroscience, and she's kind of given that all up to basically teach breathing exercises. That's literally what she does for a living. She does really well with it. And she put my cousin and I through a half-hour deep breathing exercise, and it was fascinating when you really, really focus on that, what you feel after 10 minutes, after 20 minutes, even after 30 minutes when you're done.
Really cool. Yeah, I mean, of course, the vagus nerve is part of our parasympathetic nervous system, so that calming effect, when we engage the parasympathetic nervous system, we're able to shut down the fight or flight response and engage some of that rest or digest effectively instead.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, but I mean, again, this paper underscores the importance of serotonin in all of this pathway. Actually, there are a couple of other kind of little nuggets of facts hidden within the paper that I thought also were quite telling. One of them that I wanted to touch upon was this idea that in their metabolic screen, they not only found that serotonin was low in the bloodstream of long COVID patients, they also found that kynureninic acid was high. And so you start to mention the serotonin-melatonin connection. And, all of these compounds in our body, when we absorb amino acids, they get converted into what it is that they get converted into. In the case of tryptophan, it undergoes conversion first into 5-HTP and then into 5-HT, otherwise known as serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine. And then serotonin can get converted into melatonin. But if you rewind the steps a little bit backwards, tryptophan can also get converted under certain conditions in the body to kynureninic acid. And under certain inflammatory conditions, a lot of that tryptophan can actually be robbed of its ability to go down the serotonin pathway and instead go down this kynureninic acid pathway. Now, in this paper, they found that blocking kynureninic acid synthesis did not restore the mechanism, that this really did have to do with tryptophan to serotonin absorption rather than conversion. But I thought it was an interesting fact nonetheless.
Well, it's one of those things that makes it a much stronger manuscript.
Yeah.
And why it got to be published in such a prestigious journal is because they did look at those different pathways to rule them in or rule them out.
Yeah. But I think kynureninic acid, outside of the long COVID conversation, could have a lot of potential use when we start to talk about serotonin and depression. Right? Because I'm wondering about what are the lifestyle causes of serotonin depletion in depression or mood issues. Now, I say that with the caveat that the monoamine theory of depression is kind of on shaky ground. There are some people that say, oh, of course, low serotonin is related to depression. And then there are other scientists that say, no, serotonin actually has nothing to do with depression. Maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle. But, this is this idea that, especially someone that like me that's always interested in lifestyle and dietary and nutraceutical interventions, that if you're consuming a lot of inflammatory foods, omega-6 rich foods, cheeseburgers, ding-dongs, Twinkies, blah, 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 that you're going to be steering the biosynthesis of tryptophan away from the serotonin pathway and instead towards this inflammatory state driven by kynureninic acid. And that perhaps taking anti-inflammatory supplements or lifestyle behaviors can help to reverse that. If we think about water flowing down, a forked river or something, if one side's dammed up, what do you do about that? And if one side of the river, there's a village that people need the water there or something, Mm-hmm. So I think that could be part of the conversation as well. Inflammation is, of course, not just linked to this long COVID story, although, again, the scientists actually found that this antiviral kind of response in the gut triggered the loss of the transporters, and that blunting the activation of NF-kappa B, this master regulator of inflammatory responses, help to restore the activation or the transport of tryptophan into serotonin. Makes me also think that supplements such as curcumin that block NF-kappa B should also be essential for anyone that's looking to boost their serotonin.
Right. And, another supplement, if you will, that you and I are quite familiar with that also blocks NF-kappa B is CBD, cannabidiol.
And, don't get me started on that. Actually, by all means do, because, separately from, the scientists that I talked to about CBD, like some of the ones that were really involved with discovering what it does, they say it does everything. Maybe that means it really does that, or it does nothing at all. Because you look at all this long list, eye-wateringly long list of all these targets that CBD impacts in the body. Because aside from NF-kappa B, this master regulator of inflammation response, CBD was also shown to plug into some of the serotonin receptors as direct agonists and help to rewire the brain cells to then promote an antidepressant activity. So
that reminds me of something else. I want to see if I could pull it up while I'm thinking about it. I may not be able to, but just all the potential different things that could interact with the serotonin receptors. I've got a particular slide that I would love to find and even screen share if I could find it quick enough. But I think it's.
We'll put it in the show notes.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yes.
Okay. Might take me a while to find it, but I'll eventually get there.
What is the content of the slide?
All the different things. It's a slide that looks like one of those, a diagram of the Pentagon, where they're just everywhere. It's really focuses on the ethanolamides, the acylglycerols, the acyl serotonins. Just it kind of this massive slide that encompasses a ton of different things. I said it's hard to explain without actually showing what it turns out to be.
So going back to one of the previous thoughts that I brought up regarding the relationship between serotonin and depression is this big question of what is it really doing? Where some scientists are saying that we have this theory of depression that if serotonin's low, you're more likely to be depressed. And then there are other people saying, no, there are other reasons for that. And one of the things that a lot of scientists point to that are against this idea that serotonin is what's driving depression, or the lack of serotonin is driving depression, is the fact that when you take a SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drug, that it doesn't work immediately, right? It has this therapeutic lag of usually about 2 weeks before the patient starts to see an effect of treatment. So there are other mechanisms that psychiatrists and scientists are trying to evaluate in order to understand where serotonin fits into this. One of the theories that I've heard, I don't know if this tracks with what you understand, is that when we take the SSRI drugs, that what they do is, in fact, over time, stimulate the production of BDNF. And that then causes the brain cells to rewire. And it's the rewiring activity rather than the elevation of serotonin in the synapses that comes from consumption of SSRIs that actually causes the antidepressant activity of the SSRI drugs.
And you want me to comment on that?
I just was wondering if that was something that you've come across, or if
go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, by all means.
No, you caught me still looking for that damn PowerPoint slide. You were on a roll, so I just let you go.
Okay. We can have
the idea, so the SSRIs, can take a couple weeks to really have an effect. That's one of the reasons why some people believe that the SSRIs are not really clinically relevant or do what they actually say they're supposed to do, is because if you're blocking certain enzymatic processes, which most pharmaceuticals do, you generally get a response pretty quickly. Psychiatric drugs are kind of in a world of their own. It's we now that's starting to change, I think, and looking at it genetically, you can take a genetic profile of somebody and figure out what psychiatric medicines would they respond to more than others. So, right, so you get put on, this SSRI, and you don't really, or after a month or two, you're not really getting the effect that you think you're supposed to be getting. But of course, it's multifactorial when it's psychiatric. So they change you to a different one, and then maybe they go to a different class of ones. And then, there's just psychiatric medications are, when you have an infection, you have a strep throat, you plate it out and you test it against antibiotics. We have nothing any remotely similar to that for psychiatric medicines. It is literally a trial by fire type of thing with SSRIs and most psychiatric medicines. Or a lot of them. Maybe not most, but that may be a little overstating.
Well, I think it does kind of lend some credibility to this idea that low serotonin is not everything that has to do with depression, and that instead various researchers are coming up with novel strategies to target depression instead, some of which have to do with modulation of glutamate. Of course, ketamine recently has gotten quite popularized as a compound that can be used to target depression. Ketamine, by blocking one of the major glutamate receptors, the NMDA receptor, of course, that in and of itself has recreational and dissociative activities. But the reason why that might work kind of goes back to that inflammation thing that we were talking about before. When our brain cells, last episode we talked about the microglia, and when we have this low-grade kind of inflammation, the microglia in the brain can trigger this sort of low-grade release of glutamate, which has this excitatory kind of effect. And that causes, that sort of low-grade overexcitation prunes the neurons over time. They're not able to form connections as well. People feel anxious and sensitive when there's too much glutamate. Think about people that are sensitive to MSG, or to aspartame. Both of those work on the NMDA receptor. So by blocking the NMDA receptor with ketamine or with some other compounds that are starting to be developed, it might somehow protect the brain cells from this low-grade glutamate response that might be one of the new culprits involved with depression. Who knows? I mean, the other one that they're starting to get really into, let's talk about psilocybin, right? We could spend a whole episode talking about the serotonergic hallucinogenic drugs like LSD and psilocybin. But every day you have new studies coming out showing that even microdosing with psilocybin, taking such a low dose that it doesn't cause you to trip, but you can still receive some type of benefit, and that is mediated through targeting the serotonin receptor, specifically a 5-HT2A receptor. So, you look like you want to say something.
No, I was pulling up something on my on the computer screen just behind the camera. So
Okay.
Sorry about that if that threw you off there.
No. So I just think it's really highlighting that there's a real involvement somehow in the serotonin system in depression, but perhaps not serotonin, the molecule itself. If that makes sense.
It does. I'll give like the really stupidly brief summary of like it's the brain. It is complicated, and so much we don't understand. Like I said, I'm kind of looking at this one slide that I finally found, and it's talking about everything from the um, from PEA and OEA. I know that you're going to want to get into those sometime in the near future, as opposed to just, anandamide, arachidonyl ethanolamide, and 2-arachidonyl glycerol. So you got the glycerols, but all these fatty acids, not just arachidonic acid, not just DHA or EPA, but all these fatty acids run down these same pathways, and they impact the serotonin system, the dopamine system. There's the taurines and the serines and the glycines and on and on and on. There's just so much it's just so complicated. We are just scratching the surface when we talk about the biochemistry of the brain, because we're in our infancy trying to understand that.
Well said. Really, really well said. So then, given what we do know about the brain, whatever sliver of percentage of that which we know out of that which we know that we don't know, what are the natural strategies that we can pursue specifically to boost serotonin? With the caveat that simply boosting serotonin is not enough to cure depression, but in many cases can help people feel better with their day-to-day general wellness.
Well, I think a lot of it will eventually take us back to what's now been called the endogenous cannabinoid system. And that's the fatty acids that I'm talking about that will go through these, different manifestations, if you will, and interacting with all these different receptors under the umbrella of the cannabinoid system. I think that that's where the future is going to really lie, in both our understanding but also our targeting of things. And so what are the ways you can, it's not quite exactly the way it is, but I'll say, what are the ways we can increase our cannabinoid tone? Right? And the most powerful two things that you can do every single day of your life to impact your endocannabinoid tone is diet and exercise. Just basic good lifestyle medicine. Eating healthy, eating fresh foods, real foods, not processed inflammatory foods. Getting regular exercise, and it doesn't mean you're out running a marathon every weekend. Getting regular exercise, preferably on a daily basis, even if that means just you work on the fourth floor of a building and you take the elevator up and down. Oh, use the stairs. Carry your groceries up and down the stairs. All these different things that we could be doing on a regular basis. Diet, eating healthy, because diet's probably not the right. You understand when I say diet, but but it's really about eating healthy, a Mediterranean style diet, a little more plant-based, not necessarily vegetarian, vegan diets are not necessarily great for you when you look at the overall system, but a more plant-based, fresh diet and regular exercise. All those things stimulate our endogenous cannabinoid system. And part of that ECS is the serotonin side of things. So like I said, you got the serotonin and the dopamines and the taurines and serines and glycines and, ethanolamides and so on. So they're all stimulated by diet and exercise, eating healthy and getting outside and doing the things we should be doing. Just get moving.
Yeah. And I want to just add a couple of things to that, specifically on the serotonin side of things. When we expose ourselves to vitamin D from the sun, vitamin D receptor activation by vitamin D actually leads to the increase of the expression of the enzyme that helps to convert tryptophan into serotonin. So That's really important. I mean,
I did not know that. I learned something today.
I mean, I think that is involved with, seasonal affective disorder.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
well, I mean, when I'm counseling, talking to patients, it's like, even if you don't want to exercise or you don't want to go to a gym or whatever, go walk outside, fresh air and sunshine. You get more than just the physical exercise when you go for a walk in the woods, for example. There's just an energy about being out in nature that's irreplaceable, in my opinion.
Yeah, there was a study. We don't need studies to describe everything, but there was a study that had shown that elderly people that took at least one awe-inspiring, that was the words they used, walk per week, had significantly better outcomes when it comes to their mental health overall. That just being among trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
That when the Australians met the Aboriginal people in Australia, and the tribe pointed at the trees and said, "The trees are our countrymen," right? Think about what that does for our mental health to be around, in the forest. So, but it's nice to think that there is a direct kind of biochemical or serotonergic effect that might come from being in nature in that regard. And then just in terms of what you were saying about the diet also, we need to make sure that we're getting the right B vitamins, having the correct amounts of the coenzyme forms of B12, methyl B12, folate, methylfolate, not folic acid, B6, so on and so on, are really essential in the building blocks for powering up the enzymes that are involved with the biosynthesis of serotonin. And there are certain elements as well that include magnesium and zinc that are also crucial for healthy mental health, including serotonin metabolism. There's also some herbs that I like to use. I personally have used them before. Rhodiola rosea is a really great Siberian adaptogen herb. Of course, adaptogens are herbs that help our body adapt to stress, so they don't work immediately, but they help build us resilience over time. And they actually found that rhodiola has some SSRI-like properties. So, I like to think that someone that is dealing with long COVID could, follow a completely natural course of action and use nutraceuticals that help to target inflammation, as well as to target the serotonin pathway through some of the interventions that we just described and talked about.
Well, speaking from a clinical point of view, and putting together some of the things that you've talked about and taught me today, I find clinically that the most important thing somebody can take when they're struggling either with acute COVID and probably long COVID, but definitely acute COVID, can't imagine why it would not be helpful in long COVID, is significant doses of vitamin D. And the amounts of vitamin D that I either take myself or recommend to family and friends when they're struggling with COVID are log scale times greater than what most people take on a daily basis. And I've just seen it work time and time again. And we know that one of the risk factors for getting COVID or having a worse outcome with COVID is low vitamin D levels in the blood. So it's all of what you're talking about sort of falls together and kind of almost this neat package that maybe we should be focusing on vitamin D.
Yeah. And I think, again, it really speaks to the fact that all these different pathways are in many ways unified, right? That we have, there's a connection between vitamin D and serotonin. There's a connection between vitamin D and the immune system. Now, thanks to this paper, the scientists really carefully described the connection between the immune system and serotonin. So, I think that we can celebrate in the natural products world for sure when these pathways become triangulated, because I like to think it means better health options for people that need it.
Absolutely. And, so when I'm dealing with patients, my trifecta, if you will, or three pillars are always, eating healthy, diet, exercise, as we discussed before, but what I call the third one, targeted nutritional therapy. And the real target of targeted nutritional therapy is really the brain. And how do we use nutritional therapy to help the brain? And sometimes that means helping the gut. It's there. You can't deal with one without dealing with the other. Some great. There was a great set of study out of, I think, Johns Hopkins a couple years ago that showed when they damaged the brain, it affected in experimental animals. They damaged the brain, it affected the gut biome, and not a good way. And then they reversed it. They damaged the gut biome and looked at the effects, the detrimental effects it had on the brain. So it really kind of goes back to that 4 or 6 lane or divided highway that runs between the brain and the gut. And it's not just the vagus nerves, but it's also the floating chemical soup that is in our blood, the different hormones and stuff that target the brain as well as other parts of our body. So it's complicated.
It sure is.
And we don't really have a very good understanding, but we should never, ever discount the effect of the connection between the gut and the brain.
Yeah, that's, I think you just inadvertently discovered what episode 3 of the Better Brain podcast is going to be about. So definitely make sure and stay tuned. And so listen in when we discuss that paper that you just mentioned about damaging the brain, affecting the gut, and so on. Because there's so much to unravel there. I mean, another freebie as it relates to serotonin is there are microbes within our gut that produce serotonin, that produce other neurotransmitters, psychobiotics, they call them. Never mind probiotics, right? So I think we'll have to have a psychobiotic episode in the very near future. Dr. Lewis says...
Well, I look forward to learning more from you then.
Likewise. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for the discussion today. And folks, thanks for listening to the Better Brain podcast with Miles and Dr. Lewis.